I'd like to start by thanking SciWem for inviting the Department to speak here on this very important topic. As the President said, it's going to be very, very important in the coming years. And for those of us who've been involved in waste management for some time, we'll know that this has been a very contentious issue. And when we go through it now, we'll see exactly what has been proposed. But I'd also like to thank my colleague Jean Clark, who was to speak here today, but unfortunately has a meeting in Brussels. And Jean has done tremendous work on end of waste, and she prepared most of this presentation. So thank you, Jean. As I was saying, this has always been a bone of contention for a very long time, but it's been put on a completely new level now. The fact that there is a Waste Framework Directive, and now there's a legal process by which end of waste is determined. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with waste management, I'll just quickly go through the background to the new Waste Framework Directive. It was published on the 22nd of November 2008, entered into force 20 days later on the 12th of December 2008, and it has to be transposed by 12th of December this year, and work is proceeding on that urgently at the moment. And apart from these end of waste criteria, which is Article 6, there's a few other very interesting aspects which are also now given legal effect by the new Waste Framework Directive. There's new recycling targets for 2020 under Article 11. There's the waste hierarchy is now an explicit legal requirement under Article 4, and that will be very important as well. There's also an article clarifying as to when a surplus material from an operation is to be regarded as a byproduct rather than a waste. And then there's an important article on extended producer responsibility. And there's a hugely increased focus on both waste management plans in terms of what should be in them, and also now a focus on waste prevention programs. And this is going to be very important as a part, but I'll just really stick to end of waste status in this particular talk. And I might just also say I was talking to the chairman before the meeting, and all these presentations will be up on the resource website afterwards, so you don't need to take down every single word. But why do we need end of waste criteria? Well, firstly, as long ago as 2000, when they're conceiving the 6th Environmental Action Programme, it said that we needed revised waste legislation, and in particular a clarification of the distinction between when waste ceases to be waste. And this particular call has been reiterated in their responses towards the thematic strategy on the prevention of recycling and waste by both the European Parliament and by the Council of EU Member States. And specifically, when the directive was being written, Recital 22 said that we're going to need end of waste criteria, and it suggested development of these end of waste criteria for, among others, construction demolition waste, some ashes and slag, scrap metals, aggregates, tyres, textiles, waste paper and glass. So that was the reasoning behind it. Now, what does this actually mean? In terms of the logic underpinning end of waste status, is that the waste status remains if and only if that waste controls are needed to protect both the human health and the environment. And if not, then it should have end of waste status, and this can facilitate increased recycling and recovery. So that's the logic behind developing these end of waste status. So once you develop end of waste, you're setting the criteria by which waste no longer becomes waste, and thereby is no longer subject to waste legislation. So it wouldn't be subject to the Waste Framework Directive if it was a non-waste and had ceased to be waste. And that means you wouldn't need permit requirement, you wouldn't need registration requirement, you wouldn't need to have record keeping from a waste perspective. And in turn, very importantly, many of these end of waste materials are shipped overseas and would be subject to the waste shipment regulation. So the notification requirement will not be required, and then the provisions on green listed waste will no longer apply. So this is very, very important, that if you get to a stage where waste controls are not needed, then you do not have to meet waste legislation. And the purpose of this is that if you have end of waste criteria, it should support recycling markets, it should increase recycling, and that implies that you would save energy and you would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you would also improve the implementation of waste management law. And why would this be? Well, firstly, it will harmonise across the EU what the criteria are for the end of waste. So you won't have individual countries applying their own criteria, and then particularly in a waste shipment case where you might be crossing frontiers where the other authorities wouldn't agree with that, and that can cause terrible trouble in practice. It should create legal certainty because people know if it's declared end of waste, that it is end of waste. It should reduce the administrative burdens. As I've said, you won't need to meet all these requirements for waste legislation, which are onerous and costly and time consuming. And also, very importantly, if you get the criteria right, it'll set quality criteria for secondary raw materials. So you'll know that the material is of such a standard it no longer has to be regarded as waste. And I think over the years there has been a concern that there's a certain stigma attached to a material that's regarded as a waste. So this should improve things enormously, and the industry has lobbied for this over the years to try and actually have a system which can categorically decide whether material is a waste or a non-waste. I've just put out the entire Article 6.1 there, which is the whole basis on which decisions are to be made. I won't read through it all for you, but I'll just highlight the important points there. That firstly, it must have undergone a recovery operation, including recycling. That's the first requirement. And then it must meet 4 specific criteria. Firstly, the substance must commonly be used for a specific purpose, and we'll look at these again all later. Secondly, a market or demand must exist for the material. Thirdly, it must meet the technical requirements, legislation and standards. And finally, there should be no overall adverse impacts on the environment or human health. So they're the basic reasoning behind how you might declare material as end of waste. Article 6.2 is very important in the context of this particular presentation. Remember I mentioned harmonising it across the EU. There is provision that criteria can be adopted for specific waste streams through the regulatory procedure with scrutiny via what's called the Technical Adaptation Committee, or the TAC, better known as. But basically it's a technical committee which is chaired by the Commission, and is all the member states are represented on it, and they will give an opinion to the Commission, acting on a Commission proposal. And what Article 6.2 also said is that end of waste specific criteria should be considered for wastes, including aggregates, paper, glass, metals and textiles. So in the legal text of the directive, this is actually saying there we should seriously consider aggregates, paper, glass, metals and textiles. Also important is Article 6.4, and what this says is that where criteria have not been developed at an EU level, then member states may decide on end of waste on a case-by-case basis, based on the case law and jurisprudence. But very importantly, the Commission must be notified under Directive 98/34/EC when member states set their own criteria. And under this particular directive, there is provision for objections. So it's not just a question of letting the Commission know. The Commission can challenge, or other member states can challenge the basis on which you're declaring something end of waste. And ultimately, it might not be accepted. So these are the controls that are talked about. 2 ways when end of waste criteria can be adopted. Number 1 is if member states vote in favour of a harmonised EU declaration on end of waste. And then secondly, if they decide in cases where there is no harmonised standards to develop their own end of waste criteria, they must notify the Commission under this Directive 98/34/EC, and there is provision for objections to be raised by both the Commission and other member states who do not agree with what has been done. Now, an example of that of this particular procedure is that the UK have been developing quality protocols for a number of materials. And one in particular, just to illustrate it, is the non-packaging plastics. And they have done a lot of work. They have developed what they call the quality protocol. And under this quality protocol, it makes a provision that non-packaging plastics will normally be regarded as having ceased to be waste and therefore no longer subject to waste management controls when they require no further processing before use, and specifically that they have been processed in accordance with the requirements of the relevant European and British standards listed in the protocol. They meet any additional requirements specified by the customer, and they have been supplied to the customer for use in an identified plastics manufacturing process, and they have been supplied to the customer with a quality protocol compliant safety data sheet. So you can see that what's happened is they try and develop protocols, and then they try and develop a system around it to make sure that what is happening to the material is properly being treated. So you're talking about identifying a customer, making sure it's fit for purpose, putting it to a very tight specification, and if the customer wants to add more to it and make extra demands, that is also provided for. Then it has to go to a particular process that is going to use it. This reflects one of the criteria in some of the EU jurisprudence that it must be certainty that's going to be used. Otherwise you could have a situation where something would be declared end of waste, and what would happen would be that once it's relieved of waste controls, anything could happen to it. And I think one of the key things in the whole end of waste criteria is setting very high standards. So if you go to the trouble of preparing a quality material which is equally as good as a virgin material, you're hardly going to drive to the nearest bog and try and dump it. So it's creating a commodity of considerable value and considerable investment, and in that way the use is made certain. But how does it work at the EU-wide situation when you're looking for harmonised standards? Well, there is a process that's been developed to do that for different materials. And the first step is that the background document on the waste is prepared by the Joint Research Council of the European Commission. So this is a detailed document looking at the waste, how it arises, and then how you might go about developing criteria which would remove the need to have waste controls on that material if it was supplied to this particular standard. Then a technical working group is formed and invited to comment on the background document. Now this technical working group normally consists of key industry stakeholders, so you'd have the representative bodies of the different materials. If it was metals, it'd be the metal merchants would be asked to go on it, and member states are invited, and then a certain number of them will be selected to be on this technical working group. Then workshops are held with the stakeholders and the member states on the technical working group. The background document is discussed in detail, and then finally the JRC will consider what comments have been made, and obviously those that are valid, they will take them on board, and they will produce a final technical document. And then what happens is that the final technical document is taken by DG Environment, and they will look at that, what are these criteria, and they will use the findings of that study on a particular waste in putting forward a draft Commission regulation on end of waste for a particular material. So in other words, if the study was on iron and steel, they would look at the final technical document and say, okay, this technical document says what should be done to create a material that deserves to be relieved of waste status, and would try and take the findings of that and put it into a coherent regulation, which would mean that it would be applicable across Europe. And then there's a ballot of the Technical Adaptation Committee, and two things can happen. If a qualified majority vote is in favour of adopting the draft regulation, then it will be adopted. Now, just for people who are not familiar with what happens and how qualified majority voting goes, there are three criteria. There must be more than half the member states must vote in favour of it, more than half the population of Europe must vote in favour of it, and then finally there must be a certain number, they're weighted voting. Ireland would have 7 votes, for instance. I think some of the big member states like UK, Germany would have 29 votes, but you have to get to a certain vote. 255 is the magic number. So you have to meet on those three criteria in terms of the majority of member states, majority of population, and also basic qualified majority voting. But if there's no qualified majority, it's referred to the Council of EU Member States for decision. So that is the process. But where exactly are we now? I've told you about the theory behind how it's supposed to work. But the methodology has been developed by the Joint Research Council. There was a very detailed study published in 2008 where it looked at 3 individual case studies. It looked at aggregates, it looked at compost, and it looked at metals. And it actually concluded in those 3 cases that there was a basis for moving forward and devising end-of-waste criteria. So that was decided that yes, we can go forward with these. So there was a meeting then of the Technical Application Committee, and the Commission proposed a number of candidate streams that should be taken further and developed into formalised end-of-waste criteria that would be harmonised across the EU. Now they struck very rigidly to the list I mentioned earlier in Article 6.2. So they picked 5 candidate streams. 2 of them were metal scrap from aluminium and iron, and the study has been completed, and a draft Commission regulation has been put to the Technical Application Committee, and it was actually defeated. So that now has been referred to the Council of Member States. Waste paper is another one, and in this study I just point out that they restricted what they were doing to paper fibre because it was a predominant use of waste paper. And I think there's an important principle, as far as I can make out reading through this detailed study, is that the Commission, when they're dealing with material, I think they're thinking strictly in terms of one single standard. They're not going to talk about that there might be 10 potential uses of paper. They're going to talk about just one single standard, and it's very much the highest common denominator. So again, the principle I mentioned earlier, that if you produce a high quality material, make the investment to do that, you're hardly likely to just put it in a bog. So they seem to be going, they haven't said this in as many words, but they seem to be going along the way that they want the highest common denominator. So the technical study on paper is due for completion this month, in fact. In terms of copper scrap, the technical study is due for completion next month. And in glass, the technical study is due for completion in March 2011. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, there's been end-of-waste candidates identified. Again, there's been a little bit of discussion over this. Different people want different things. But work on end-of-waste for bio-waste was announced in the May 2010 communication on bio-waste. And the pilot study, as I mentioned, on compost, the case study was completed in 2008. So it's envisaged that this will be a 1-year project to bring it to a situation where they have a technical study completed, and they haven't started the work yet, but they intend to. Also in plastics, they have carried out a background study, and it's anticipated the study will be completed within 1 year of formal start of the project, which hasn't started yet. So they're hoping to do 3 studies in phase 2. So they've identified 2 that they're going to do. And then there's a number of other candidates that might be considered for the 3rd study. And these have been mentioned: C&D waste, plasterboard, textiles, and tyres. And in terms of textiles, background study has been completed. And some of the suggestions that came from the member states were C&D waste derived aggregates and solvents. But I think, knowing the Commission as I do, the fact that a background study is completed in textiles, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised to see them proceeding with textiles. But I think the thing that surprised a lot of people at the last Technical Application Committee is that the Commission announced that they had started a study on the suitability of waste-derived fuels for end-of-waste. So people were a bit surprised about that because that hadn't been flagged. And it emerged during the discussions afterwards that apparently 2 member states had made notifications to the Commission under Directive 98/34/EC that I mentioned before about different waste-derived fuels. And the Commission has raised objections to both of these on the basis that they do not conform to Article 6 of the Waste Framework Directive. So what the Commission has said is that they carried out this study because they realise this is going to be an issue where people feel, different member states feel, that they would like to have end-of-waste status for various fuels. And they want to make sure that when these notifications come to the Commission, that they will be very well informed as to whether there is potential for such materials to be declared as end of waste. But there's going to be no further moves on this end of waste for refuse-derived fuels until this study is concluded at the end of 2011. So I don't know how many people here have read these detailed reports, but the way that it works is that the concept that they have in terms of developing end of waste criteria is that you have the principle that waste ceases to be a waste when a safe and useful product is placed on the market, and as I said before, that it can be used without the need for waste controls to protect the environment and human health. And then under Article 6.1 we have these 4 criteria I mentioned, that is commonly used for a specific purpose, a market or demand exists, it meets technical requirements, standards and legislation, and that there's no overall adverse impacts on the human health or the environment. So that's what you're trying to do. But when you actually look at the chain of production of a product, you're looking at input material, you're looking at processing, you're looking at output material, and you're also looking at the controls that are placed on that whole process to make sure that not only do you get what you're trying to get out of the product, but that you can actually assure people that it is exactly what you're saying it is, and that information is available for the people to use the product. So that is, you're trying to marry those 3 concepts of a safe and useful product against the criteria of Article 6.1, and then to integrate that into the common chain of production of a product from waste. And just to actually reiterate what's in Article 6.1, in fulfilment of end of waste, it applies to a waste and not a byproduct. The byproduct is Article 5. That will be a lecture for another day, I think. It must have undergone a recovery operation. This is explicitly stated in Article 6.1. And then 4 specific criteria have to be fulfilled. It's commonly used for a specific purpose, a market or demand exists, it meets the technical requirements, standards and the legislation, and that finally it can be used without any overall adverse impacts on the environment and human health. So in the concept I talked about, how you might do it in terms of looking for a safe and useful product, meeting the criteria, how you might actually impose specific criteria in the waste stream. But basically the JRC study findings have established the following sets of criteria for end of waste. First and most importantly are the product quality requirements, and the standards are high, I'd have to say. Then there's requirements in input materials. If you haven't got your feedstock right, as people in waste management would know, it's going to be very hard to get a quality product. There's going to be requirements on the treatment processing techniques. They must be done correctly and systematically. There's requirements for quality assurance procedures to make sure that you're sure that this has been done. Not only is the system capable of doing it, but it does actually happen. And also then to produce information on these materials. And just maybe to give it a little bit of practical application.
What would
all this translate into? I'm just going to give you one example. This is the draft regulation that was beaten in the vote at the Technical Adaptation Committee, but will go to the Council of EU Member States. In terms of the scrap metal proposed decision, the product quality that's talked about here is compliance with a metal scrap specification. That could be either, say, a SEN standard, or else an industry standard, or a customer specification. Sterols, which are effectively things that you don't want, have to be less than 2% for iron and steel, or less than 5% for aluminium. It should be free of visible oil, it should be free of radioactivity, and there should be no display of hazardous properties. In terms of the input material and treatment, there should be segregation at source, and very importantly, the waste with hazardous properties has to be depolluted. And then there's also quality management requirements and a statement of conformity which will say that this has been done properly. In terms of the paper, this is only based on the background study at the time, that the product quality would be compliant with the standard, probably EN 642 is the only one, 643 it should be. non-paper components less or equal to 1.5%. Again, no hazardous properties. The waste paper must not contain absorbed fluids such as oil, solvents, paints, aqueous or fatty foodstuffs. The input material and treatment, again, no hazardous components, foodstuffs, bio-waste, mixed municipal waste, and then commingled collection is allowed. So that's a very important aspect for paper, because in Ireland most of paper is collected through commingled collection, and the input material should be kept separate from other materials. But the treatment then will need to prepare it for direct input into the process. And again, quality management and statement of conformity are important. And just final conclusions there. Just to say again that end of waste is not an absolute requirement for materials. People can choose to go by the waste controls route should they wish to do so. So it's optional if you want to go for end of waste. It may be very onerous to fulfill the end of waste criteria. I think some of these are going to be very onerous. We need to streamline the procedures for the operation of the quality management systems. For instance, in terms of free radioactivity, you want to have a situation where you don't need a qualified radiographer sitting there on your scrap yard, making sure every bit is there. And then, very important too, that once it comes end of waste, the waste shipment controls do not present problems for end of waste materials. So what you don't want to have is to have an end of waste, proudly transporting it, and then to be challenged by authorities and say that they're not prepared to accept that. So I think some sort of guidance is going to be needed from the Commission on this. So thank you very much for your attention, and if I have time for questions, I'll certainly try and answer them. Or if you want to contact me in the PowerPoint, you're very, very welcome.